The council chamber smelled like nothing I could name. A mix of recycled air, something faintly chemical, and the quiet pressure of 47 species pretending to be calm. I had been sitting in that hall for 6 minutes, and already 3 different alien delegates had looked at me the way people look at a stray animal that wandered into a formal dinner. Curious. Slightly revolted, waiting for someone else to deal with it. My name is Ilara Voss. I am 39 years old. I have served in the Earth Defense Corps for 16 years. 2 planetary campaigns, 1 orbital siege, and a ground engagement on Titan that nobody in the government likes to discuss in public anymore. The Titan campaign lasted 19 months. By the time it ended, 600,000 people had been displaced. 2 of my closest friends were dead, and I had developed particular stillness that my therapist later described as functional dissociation, and that I prefer to call professional calm. I have held the rank of commander for 4 years. For the last 8 months I have also held a second title that nobody in human history has ever carried before: Earth's delegate to the Galactic Council. The chamber on Vale Prime was enormous in the way that buildings constructed by civilizations older than human writing tend to be enormous, not sized to impress but scaled for permanence, for the assumption that whatever happened inside these walls would still be happening here, 1,000 years from now. The ceiling curved upward in a perfect dome, made from something that looked like glass but clearly was not, since it bent light in ways that glass could not, sending slow soft refractions down the tiered walls at angles that shifted depending on where you stood. I had spent a few minutes watching those slow light patterns during the procedural opening, before I caught myself and made myself stop. I was not here to be impressed, I was here to work. The seats were arranged in a wide circle, rising in tiers like an ancient theater built by someone who believed that architecture should remind its occupants of their place in something larger than themselves. Each section was designed for the specific biology of the species occupying it. The Pellari, tall and thin with elongated skulls and 4-jointed arms, had seats that rose nearly 2 meters high with deep curved backs that cradled their unusual spinal structure. The Greth, who were low to the ground and wider than they were tall, and moved with a constant rolling motion that never fully stopped even when they were ostensibly sitting still, occupied low curved pods that looked almost like sleeping beds. Dozens of other configurations surrounded them, each one a small testament to the biological variety this institution contained. The Veth Dominion delegation sat in a raised section at the far end of the chamber, behind a partition of dark material that absorbed light so completely it looked less like a divider, and more like a section of the wall that had been removed and replaced with pure dark. I had studied photographs of Veth architectural preferences before coming here, and understood that this was a deliberate design choice. Something to do with how they processed visual information, and how they preferred to present themselves in formal settings. I understood it intellectually. Sitting across a large room from a pool of deliberate darkness that contained beings I could not clearly see still, produced a particular feeling in my chest that I noted and set aside. I sat in a standard seat provided by the Council for the human delegation. Before I had accepted this posting, my commander at the time had asked me what I knew about diplomacy. I had told him I knew it was a kind of warfare conducted with language instead of weapons, that the casualties were slower and the terrain harder to read. He had looked at me for a long moment and then said that was the most accurate description of the field he had ever heard from someone who had no formal training in it, and that I should probably be terrified of this job. I had told him I was already terrified of it. He had told me that was the right starting point. 8 months in, I was no longer terrified. I was something more useful than terrified. I was alert in the way that you are alert in an environment where the rules are not the rules you learned, and the people around you have been playing the same game for much longer than you have been alive. Every session I had attended since arriving here had taught me something. Most of what it had taught me was how little I understood, but the learning was real, and it was accumulating. And the specific things I had learned in the past 72 hours had clarified the situation in a way that made the path forward, if not simple, at least visible. A plain chair, roughly approximating human proportions without any real consideration for them. I had brought my own back support, a small wedge of firm foam I had purchased at a shop near the transit port when I first arrived on Vale Prime, and nobody had commented on it. The absence of comment was itself a kind of comment. It told me how much thought had gone into our arrival. From across the chamber, the Veth section was the one place I had not been able to stop returning to with my eyes since I sat down. The dark partition absorbed the chamber light and gave nothing back. Behind it, The Veth delegation was present but deliberately obscured, a choice that I had initially read as practical and now read as intentional. You cannot watch something you cannot see. You cannot read the reaction of an opponent who has arranged to be unreadable. They had been sitting in chambers like this one for 200 years, and the partition was not a biological requirement. It was a preference, a way of managing the information available to everyone else in the room. I had noted this. I had noted everything I could about them, because information about an opponent is the beginning of everything else. What I had in the archive had been more valuable than what I could observe across a chamber, but observation was not nothing. The way they moved, the way they held themselves. The particular quality of Scrath's stillness that I had been studying since the first session, trying to understand what was underneath it and what, if anything, would change it. I thought I was about to find out. The session had not officially started yet. Around me, delegates murmured in a dozen languages that my translation earpiece rendered in flat, careful tones. I caught fragments as the earpiece sorted through the noise. Trade corridor realignment, resource quota disputes. A boundary survey that had been pending for 18 years, the ordinary administrative machinery of a civilization that had been running continuously for longer than human history had records. There was an ease in those voices, the ease of people doing something so familiar that it required no conscious effort. Routine, the particular comfort of the deeply established. I was the only person in that room who had to think carefully about each small thing, each movement, each expression, each moment of silence and what it would communicate to people, whose biological cues and cultural contexts I was still learning at a speed that was probably too slow. A soft chime moved through the chamber like a note struck on a very large, very old bell. The grand mediator of the Galactic Council, a being from the species I had learned to call the Vieli, moved from his station at the edge of the room to the central platform. The Vieli had built this place and had maintained it for longer than most. Member species had existed as organized civilizations, and they carried the weight of that history in their movements. 7 feet tall, silver-gray skin that caught light differently at different angles, and pure white eyes that moved independently of each other in a way I had spent weeks training myself not to find disconcerting. The mediator's name was Counselor Owen. I had met him in a private orientation session during my first week here. He had been precise, formal, and entirely uninterested in anything I said that did not pertain directly to the procedural mechanics of my assigned role. The 641st open session of the Galactic Council is called to order, Owen said. His voice carried through the chamber without any amplification I could detect, reaching every seat with the same clarity it had at its source. The primary matter before this body concerns the territorial and resource dispute between the Veth Dominion and the newly admitted human collective, referred to in formal proceedings as the Terran Assembly. I still did not like that name. Nobody had asked us what we wanted to be called. I had submitted a formal written objection to the Council Administrative Office during my first month and been informed it was a standard designation, applied to all new member species at admission and would be reviewed at the 5-year membership mark. I had let it go. There were considerably larger things to focus on. The Veth Dominion has submitted a formal grievance and a resolution proposal, Owen continued, his independent white eyes moving slowly across the assembled room in a pattern I had not yet learned to read. The Terran Assembly delegate is recognized to receive this proposal and respond at a time to be scheduled by this body. In the interim, both parties are asked to maintain current positions and avoid further escalation of the present situation. Current positions. That was the Council's careful way of describing a state of affairs that included 3 human colony worlds: Prospect Station, New Meridian, and Harrow's Rest, home to roughly 400,000 people in aggregate, sitting behind a Veth blockade that had been in place for 11 days. Ships could not enter or leave the blockaded zones. Supply deliveries had been stopped at the perimeter. Medical resupply vessels had been turned away. The colonists were not yet facing an immediate acute crisis, but 11 days was long enough for fear to settle into people's bodies and frighten people in isolated places with limited resources and no information about when conditions might improve, had a way of making decisions that were very hard to undo later. I had seen it happen. I did not want to see it happen to 400,000 people at once. I kept my face neutral. My hands were flat on the table. From across the chamber, one of the Veth delegates tilted its head in my direction. The Veth were unlike anything I had encountered in my time before coming here, and my time before coming here had included some genuinely unusual encounters. They were tall and angular, built on a six-limbed architecture with two pairs of upper arms and one pair of legs, all jointed at angles that looked structurally improbable by human anatomy standards, but clearly functioned without difficulty. Their exoskeleton was a deep matte black that seemed to consume rather than simply absorb the light that fell on it. Their faces had no visible eyes, only two horizontal slits positioned low on the head section, and these slits somehow managed to convey absolute disdain more clearly than any human facial expression I had ever observed. The delegate looking at me made a slow small movement with one upper limb, possibly a greeting. The translation system offered no interpretation either way. I did not respond. The session closed without resolution, the response deadline set at 3 days from now, and the other delegates began filtering out in clusters. Several of them looked at me as they passed. A few stopped at a slight distance and observed me with the particular quality of attention that people give to things they are trying to fit into existing categories and finding they cannot. I had been receiving this kind of attention since arriving on Vale Prime. The first delegate who had approached me, a small pale being from a species called the Larry, had stood in front of me for nearly a full minute before saying, through the translation system, that I was shorter than they had expected. I had told them I was average height for my species. They had appeared to find this more interesting than reassuring. A delegate from the Pelari Union approached as I was gathering my materials. Counselor Ren Alos, 70 years of active council service. Present for 17 admission proceedings, 4 major boundary realignments, and the only full council vote on military intervention in recorded history, which had ended in a tie and been resolved through a procedural mechanism that 3 subsequent committees had been convened to examine. He had the quality that effective diplomats of great experience sometimes develop, an absolute stillness that gave away nothing and suggested depths that casual observation could not sound. Commander Voss, he said, I trust the facilities have been adequate. They're fine, I said. I wanted to offer some perspective if you're willing to receive it. I'm listening. He was still for a moment, his eyes moving slowly around the emptying room in what I read as a habitual security check, practiced into automaticity. The Veth have done this before, he said, keeping his voice low. This approach, these terms, it is not new. The terms will seem severe because they are designed to seem severe. But our history suggests that compliance leads to stability. Many of our members have faced very similar moments in their early years of council membership. The ones who accepted the terms were able to continue forward, to grow in time. The ones who refused found the path afterward considerably more difficult and considerably less predictable. A pause. I say this not to pressure you in either direction, Commander, but to give you context I believe you should have before you make your response. I held his gaze for a long moment. Thank you, Counselor. I appreciate you telling me. He gave the small formal farewell gesture of his species and walked away with the unhurried movement of someone for whom this particular conversation had become a kind of habit. He did not look back at the door. I waited until the chamber was nearly empty. I watched the lights dim in the Veth section, watched the last delegates leave, watched the council staff begin their quiet end-of-session routines. Then I gathered my things and walked back through the long corridor to my quarters in the residential block. I sat down at my desk. I did not turn off the lamp, I did not sleep. I opened the archive and started reading. The archive access that came with my delegate credentials covered 300 years of open session records. Every filing, every proceeding, every vote, its outcome, and every statement made before it. I had been told during orientation that the access was complete and unrestricted within the open record category. What nobody had mentioned was that the archive had no useful organizational structure for someone coming to it without decades of council administrative experience, no summary, no index that made any sense outside its own internal logic, just the raw material of 3 centuries of interstellar governance, organized in a way that assumed deep prior familiarity. I spent the first hour simply learning how to navigate the system. Real coffee, from a packet I had brought from home, because the council-provided variant looked correct and tasted like warm paper with a slightly metallic finish, and I needed my thinking to work at full capacity. By the second hour I had found the Veth Dominion's session history. By the third hour I had identified the pattern I was looking for. By the fourth hour I had stopped drinking coffee because my stomach had gone cold, and I did not want anything in it. 19 formal grievances submitted by the Veth against other member species over 230 years of council membership. 16 of those 19 resolved through what the filing system called negotiated settlement. I pulled every settlement document and read them in order, making notes by hand on a paper pad I had brought from home because I think more clearly with something physical to write on. Every single time without exception, the smaller or newer species had surrendered the primary resources in question. Every single time, the Veth had framed their terms as fair, as temporary, as offered in the generous good faith of an established senior partner toward a valued newer member of the community. Every single time, in the decades that followed the settlement, the species that had agreed had become smaller. Fewer colonies, reduced fleet capacity, reduced representation in this chamber, reduced ability to object the next time a similar demand was made of them. Nothing sudden or obvious. Nothing that would register clearly in any single session or any single reporting period. The slow, consistent accumulation of 1,000 small disadvantages, each one defensible in isolation, all pointing in exactly the same direction when viewed across time. I made notes on every settlement I read. The amounts varied, the timelines varied, the specific resources in question varied from case to case, mineral extraction rights in one, transit corridor access in another, water world atmospheric processing in a third. What did not vary was the direction of the exchange. What did not vary was the language used to describe it. What did not vary was what happened in the decades after the signature was placed on the document. I thought about what Ren Alice had said. The ones who accepted the terms were able to continue, to grow over time. I looked at the population statistics appended to each case file, the colony counts, the fleet registrations, the council voting records. I measured what continuing and growing looked like in numbers across the decades that followed each settlement. The numbers were not dramatic. That was the most alarming thing about them. They were not the numbers of a civilization in visible decline. They were the numbers of a civilization in extremely slow decline, the kind of decline that produces no emergency, no obvious crisis, no moment where someone looks up and says that something has gone wrong. Just the quiet, patient, incremental reduction of everything that makes a civilization capable of being itself. The capacity for self-determination shrinking by degrees until the degrees themselves become invisible against the baseline. The ones who continued and grew had continued and grown into something smaller than what they had been. That was what compliance led to. That was the stability Ren Alos had been describing, without knowing what he was describing. I made a note of this and kept reading. I found the records for the 3 cases that had not resulted in settlement. 2 had gone to arbitration. The rulings had been partial victories for the smaller species. The Veth had formally accepted both rulings with the correct procedural language and the appropriate gestures of compliance with this council's decisions. In the years that followed each ruling, the Veth had made a series of trade decisions, transit decisions, and partnership decisions that were cataloged individually in the archive under various administrative categories. Read together, they were very clear. Supply routes that had previously served the 2 species were quietly reorganized. Partner agreements lapsed without renewal at the standard review points. Transit permissions issued under long-standing arrangements were not extended when they came up. Both species were technically still active council members. Neither had expanded in a century. Neither had the resources to do so anymore. The third case was the one that stopped me completely. A species called the Duran. I had not heard of them before tonight. They had been a mid-sized member species, roughly comparable to humanity in population and territorial reach at the time of their conflict with the Veth 62 years ago. They had refused a Veth territorial demand. The case file ran to 40 pages of formal proceedings across 9 council sessions. Reading the careful procedural language of those transcripts, I could feel the shape of what had happened beneath the official language. A species standing up in a room that was not built for that kind of standing. Making arguments that were legally and logically correct. Being listened to politely. Receiving no support of any practical kind from anyone with the power to provide it. The file ended. At the very bottom of the last document in the case file, a single administrative notation in plain unformatted text, 2 words. Culturally dissolved. I read those 2 words several times, not because I did not understand them, because the understanding required a moment to settle into something I could carry. I had not heard of the Duran before tonight. They had not appeared in any briefing I received before coming to Vale Prime. They had not been mentioned in any orientation sessions or in any conversation I had participated in during my 8 months here. A species that had been a full council member 62 years ago, present enough to have 40 pages of proceedings filed under their name, arguing for their existence and their future. Gone so completely that they existed now only as an archived notation and a file that nobody had opened in years. I closed the archive. I sat in my quiet room on Vale Prime, 400 light-years from Earth, and I let myself feel what I was feeling. Not fear. Fear is the response to a threat you are not confident you can manage. What I was feeling was colder than fear and considerably more useful. The particular state that I had developed over 16 years of service in situations where the stakes were real, and the available time was limited, where the correct response had to be found without the luxury of lengthy deliberation. My first commanding officer on my first deployment had a name for this state. He called it finding the floor. You go down through everything that is uncertain, and everything that is frightening, and everything that is outside your control until you hit the thing that is solid and knowable and yours to act on. Then you act on it. I had found the floor. I got up from the desk and walked to the window. Vale Prime's orbital ring was visible from my quarters at night, a faint arc of light that the planet's rotation brought in and out of view over the course of the local hour. I watched it for a while. The ring represented 3 centuries of continuous infrastructure, built by species I had never heard of before arriving here, maintained by processes I did not fully understand, carrying the freight and personnel of 47 civilizations that had been making contact and trade and agreements and arguments with each other since long before humanity had developed writing. 3 centuries, and in that 3 centuries, one species had managed to remove another species so thoroughly that the only remaining record was an administrative notation in a file that nobody opened. I was not naive enough to think that the Veth were uniquely terrible. History, including 5,000 years of our own, contained ample evidence that the capacity for this kind of slow, systematic removal of other people was not restricted to any single species or civilization. It was a feature of organized power when organized power was permitted to operate without meaningful accountability for long enough. The Veth were not exceptional. They had simply found an environment in which accountability was structured in ways that allowed them to do what they were doing, and they had been doing it for 200 years, and they were very good at it. The question was never whether it was possible to do something different. The question was always who was willing to absorb the cost of doing it. I had read the files. I had measured the cost, as best I could measure it from this distance, and I had decided, in the particular way that decisions get made when you have found the floor, and there is nothing below it, that the cost was acceptable, that the alternative was not. I opened a secure channel to Earth Defense Corps Command. Lieutenant Cole Garrett answered on the second signal, a man I had worked alongside twice in previous postings and trusted without reservation. He read my expression and kept his own neutral. I need Admiral Pierce on a secure channel, I said. No log entry on either end. Yes, Commander, stand by. Pierce came on 4 minutes later, still straightening his uniform jacket. I told him what I had found in the archive over the past 4 hours, concisely and in sequence, and then I told him what I needed from him. No preamble, no softening. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at something to the side of his screen that I could not see. You understand the full weight of what you're asking, he said. It was not a question. It was a statement given in the form of a question to provide me the opportunity to confirm or revise. I've read 60 years of this council's records tonight, I said. Every species that made the choice I'm being asked to make right now is smaller today than it was when it made that choice. Some of them are gone. There's one phrase in the archive for the ones that are gone. I paused. I'm certain. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions that other people would have to live with, you'll have everything you need. I closed the channel, drank the rest of the cold coffee, lay down on the narrow bed in my quarters and slept for a few hours. I dreamed about a light going out, no shape to it, no face, no voice. Just a light that dimmed by increments so small that each individual moment was identical to the one before it. And by the time the dark was complete, anyone who might have noticed had long since stopped looking. I woke before dawn, local time on Vale Prime, and I felt, for the first time since arriving here, entirely ready. The formal response session was held in the main chamber on the 3rd day. Every delegate seat was filled. The council staffer escorting me through the corridor mentioned this was unusual, that these proceedings typically drew the parties directly involved, and a small observer contingent. The fact that every section was occupied, and that several delegations had brought Ajit's staff members, White told me that word had moved through this building in the days since the first session. Every species represented here had heard something about the new species and its situation, and had decided that whatever was about to happen in this room was worth watching in person. I noted this, filed it, kept walking. The Veth ambassador was already positioned on the presenting platform when I entered. Overlord Scrath, the largest Veth I had seen, with an exoskeleton that held a faint blue iridescence under the chamber's light, like the surface of deep water at the last moment before full dark. He held himself with the absolute stillness of something that had never needed to be nervous and therefore lacked any conception of what nervousness felt like from inside. Owen opened the session, standard procedural language, names, parties, purpose, timeline. Then he gestured to the Veth platform. Scrath spoke. His voice through the translation system was flat and even and entirely without feeling, like a machine reading a document aloud, with no relationship to the content it was producing. He outlined the terms with the practiced efficiency of an entity for whom this exercise was well worn. Humanity would withdraw all territorial claims to the 3 disputed colony sectors within 90 days. Humanity would grant the Veth Dominion full mining and resource extraction rights across those sectors for a period of 200 years, with a right of renewal at the Veth's discretion. Humanity would issue a formal apology to the Council, acknowledging that its expansion during the prior decade had demonstrated insufficient regard for the established territorial interests of senior Council's members and would commit to submitting all future expansion proposals to an oversight committee chaired by the Veth Dominion. There was also a financial contribution to a fund Scrath called Restoration for disruption caused to Veth commercial operations. He used the word reasonable 4 times. He used the word mutual 3 times. He talked about harmony and stability, and the responsibility of new members to honor the traditions that had maintained interstellar peace for centuries. Every sentence was technically crafted to carry the sound of something a fair-minded person might find acceptable, while carrying inside it the actual substance of everything he was proposing to take. It was impressive work, in a way. Professional, thoroughly practiced. When he finished, Owen turned to me. The Terran Assembly delegate is recognized to respond. I stood. The chamber carried the specific quality of a room in which everyone had already decided what they were about to witness. The particular quiet of an audience waiting for the expected outcome to confirm itself. I looked at Scrath for a moment. He was completely still. The horizontal slits on his face section conveyed nothing I could read. I said, "Humanity does not negotiate under threat. We never have." I sat back down 2 sentences. That was my entire formal response. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the chamber came apart. Delegates speaking over each other in a dozen languages simultaneously. The translation system struggling to separate the streams before giving up and delivering overlapping noise. I caught fragments between the waves. Reckless, unprecedented. Does she understand what she is saying? Dangerous precedent. No grounding in council tradition. Several delegates were on their feet. Ren Alos had turned completely in his seat to look at me with an expression I could only describe as genuine alarm. The expression of a man who had spent 70 years in this work and had not expected to see this particular thing in it. Scrath did not move. He observed me with those lightless slits for a long, deliberate moment, and then he made a sound, a grinding, clicking sequence that rose and fell in a pattern the translation system rendered as laughter. Endearingly primitive, the translation said. Several delegates around the chamber visibly relaxed at the sound. The laughter communicated something to them. The message that this was a misunderstanding rather than a threat. A new species failing to grasp how things worked here. Something manageable and familiar, rather than something that required a new kind of response. The tension in the room shifted, settling back into the shape of something the room knew how to contain. I let the laughter run. Then I reached into the carrying case beside my chair and removed a data chip. Standard council format, compatible with every display system in this room. I had spent most of the previous night preparing it, using a secure link to the Earth Defense Corps historical archive. I walked to the central podium and placed the chip on the surface. This contains a complete record of human military history, I said, speaking clearly and without urgency. Every documented conflict from the first organized armed engagement in our recorded history, approximately 5,000 years ago, to the most recent operation 8 months ago. I would ask every delegate in this chamber to review it before this session concludes. Owen looked at me with his independent white eyes. Commander Voss, this is not standard procedure. No, I said, but it is directly relevant to this body's understanding of the party it is. Evaluating, he considered for a moment, then nodded to a council staffer. The chip was connected to the chamber's central distribution system and sent to every delegate's personal display. The room went quiet in a completely different way, the absorbed silence of reading. I went back to my seat and waited. The file was substantial. 5,000 years is a long time and we had documented almost all of it. The archive contained the full arc of human armed conflict, from the organized warfare of ancient city-states and the resource wars of the expansion centuries, through the great civilizational catastrophes that should by any reasonable calculation have ended us, and through the recoveries that had followed, the grinding, stubborn, often brutal work of rebuilding that had, generation after generation, somehow produced a civilization that continued past every point at which continuation should logically have stopped. It was not a comfortable document. I had grown up with it, been educated in it, been shaped by its weight in ways I was still sometimes discovering. It contained things I was not proud of and things I was proud of in a way that resisted simple articulation. Every mistake and every improbable recovery. Every time a human civilization had been reduced to what looked like its absolute minimum and had found, somewhere past that minimum, a direction forward that nobody had predicted. We had burned things to the ground and rebuilt them. We had been occupied and scattered and reduced, and every single time we had come back, not cleanly, not gracefully, not without enormous cost to everyone involved. But we had come back. I watched the chamber, read about that. The clicking laughter from the Veth section had stopped. Scrath had set down his display twice and picked it back up. Two of his subordinates were in a low conversation that did not carry across the room. The absolute stillness that had defined his presence in this chamber, since the first session, had developed a different texture. Not agitation. Something more controlled than agitation. A recalculation happening in real time, working through something that had not been in the original calculation. The Greth had stopped their rolling motion entirely. Ren Alos had both hands flat on the table and was looking at something not present in the room. Representative Nail of the Inari, the small blue-gray delegate from the rear section, whose name I had since learned from a session roster, was reading with a concentrated focus that looked qualitatively different from the polite observational attention most of the delegates had brought to the earlier proceedings. Before that minute was up, I watched something happen that I had not quite expected, and that I have thought about many times since. In the middle section of the chamber, 3 delegates from a species called the Sari, small beings with 4 upper limbs and a complex bioluminescent pattern in their skin that I had learned expressed emotional state, were reading the archive on their personal displays. The bioluminescent patterns in their skin shifted during the reading in a way I had not seen before. When I had encountered the Sari in earlier sessions, their skin had carried a steady low-level blue that I had been told indicated neutral attention. As they read the archive, the blue shifted into something with more variation in it, a pulsing pattern that I did not have the cultural vocabulary to fully interpret, but that several Sari delegates around them appeared to be responding to. They were talking to each other through their skin, without words, in a language that required no translation system. And whatever they were saying was producing visible response in the delegates around them. I did not know what they were communicating, but I watched it happen, and I noted that the Sari section had been very still and very blue during all the preceding sessions and was now alive with moving light. On the other side of the chamber, a delegate from a species I knew only by their administrative designation, whose biology was so different from mine that I had no real basis for reading their emotional state, had set down their display and was simply sitting very still with all 4 of their primary sensory organs oriented toward the display screen. Not reading anymore, done reading. Sitting with what they had read. A full minute passed without anyone speaking. Then Nail, in a voice quiet enough that only the chamber's acoustics made it audible throughout the room, said something in their own language. The translation came through my earpiece as a single sentence, directed to no one in particular, spoken like someone thinking aloud. They have been doing this for 5,000 years. Watched different delegates read different sections at different speeds. Some moved through it quickly, scanning rather than reading, the way people read documents they are not sure will contain anything relevant to them. Others slowed significantly at certain points. I had a general sense of which points those were, having assembled the archive myself, and I watched the delegates who slowed at those points. Watched their expressions change. Watched them go back and read something a second time. Watched some of them set down their display for a moment and look at nothing in particular. There is a section in the archive from the resource wars of the 22nd century, about 400 years before humanity had any conception of being observed by anyone. A period when 3 separate civilizational blocks had been in active conflict across 4 continents simultaneously, when certain military technologies had been deployed that had consequences that lasted generations, when the word civilization was being used to describe things that were in the process of not surviving. The section is factual and detailed, and it reads, if you come to it without the context of what came after, like a document about the end of something. What comes after is the part that the delegates seem to be reading twice. What comes after is a century of rebuilding, then expansion, then two more major conflicts, both of which also looked at the time like possible endings, then more rebuilding, then the development of certain technologies, then certain social frameworks, then the long grinding work of integrating a species that had been divided against itself into something coherent enough to eventually get off its home planet and look at what was out there. We were still here, that was the thing. Underneath all the disaster, and all the horror and all the moments when the obvious outcome was that this species was finished, we were still here. Not because we were wise, not because we were careful, because we were relentlessly, stubbornly, sometimes irrationally unwilling to accept that we were finished. It was not an admirable quality in isolation. It was a dangerous quality in isolation. But it was ours and it was real, and any accurate assessment of what we were had to include it. The delegates reading the archive were doing an accurate assessment. I could see it happening in real time. I could see the recalculation taking place across 47 different physiologies and 47 different sets of cultural assumptions about what a species was and what a new species in particular was. The category of new species had a shape in this room, a shape built over centuries of admissions proceedings and early membership negotiations, a shape that involved certain predictable behaviors and certain predictable limits. What they were reading in the archive did not fit that shape. That was the point. No one answered. No one needed to. I looked at Scrath. He looked back at me. The laughter was completely gone. Owen called a formal pause in proceedings to allow the delegates time to review the material fully. 1 hour. The chamber broke into smaller conversations. I stayed in my seat. Several delegates passed my section without stopping, but two of them slowed in a way that felt deliberate, not quite making eye contact, but not quite avoiding it either. Something between acknowledgement and uncertainty. Something that had not been there before. When the session resumed, Owen recognized Scrath to respond. Scrath's delivery was brief and had a precision to it that had not been in his morning presentation. He said emotional appeals to historical conflict were not a substitute for legal and territorial obligations. He said new members were expected to conform to established norms, regardless of whatever conflicts their species had conducted among themselves, on a single world. He said the phrase "on a single world" with a particular emphasis that was meant to make the geography of our history its most important feature. I asked to be recognized and Owen gave me the floor. I looked directly at Scrath. I kept my voice the same level throughout, the voice I used in briefings when the information was important enough to carry itself without volume. The Overlord is correct that our history was conducted primarily within our own system, I said. For most of that history we had only ourselves to fight, and we developed accordingly. Every weapon system, every tactical doctrine, every strategic concept our people have built was constructed on the assumption that our opponent was as motivated, as resourceful, and as unwilling to stop as we were. A pause. We do not have the habit of stopping when conditions become difficult. We have tried to develop that habit several times. It has never taken. Another pause. I would ask the Overlord to consider whether the geography of our history is truly its most relevant feature, or whether something else in the archive I just shared deserves closer attention. I sat down. The chamber was quiet. Owen closed the session for the day. I went back to my quarters, made myself eat something, and reviewed the fleet positioning report for the 4th time before finally sleeping. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everyone had done exactly what I had asked. In the morning there was a notification waiting on my terminal. The Veth Dominion had sent a formal message to the full council overnight. It stated that they were maintaining all current blockade actions, and that they expected a substantive response from the Terran Assembly within 48 hours. It was signed by Overlord Scrath and copied to every delegation in the chamber. I read it twice, sent a brief update to Admiral Pierce, and began preparing for the next session. The special session Scrath had called was added to the morning agenda, directly before the scheduled vote on the formal proposal. I arrived early and watched the chamber fill. The quality of presence in the room was different from the previous sessions. Something in the overnight had shifted the atmosphere. I could feel it without being able to name it precisely, the particular feeling of a space where significant decisions have already been made in private conversations, and the formal proceedings are the mechanism for making those decisions public. The Veth delegation came in as a group. Scrath took his platform. 2 of his usual subordinates were absent. The empty spaces in the Veth section were more noticeable than their presence would have been. Owen opened the session. He recognized Scrath immediately. Scrath submitted 3 requests. First, a formal censure of the Terran Assembly for distributing what he called threatening and destabilizing historical materials without council authorization. Second, a required formal apology from the Terran Assembly to the full body for disrupting proceedings. Third, and presented last, and as the most compassionate element of the package, an authorization for Veth Dominion ships to provide what he called humanitarian oversight of the blockaded colony worlds, to ensure that the basic needs of the humans on those worlds were being properly met. He used the word compassion when he presented the third item. He said the Veth were concerned about the welfare of those people. He said the Dominion wished to demonstrate, in practical terms, their commitment to the well-being of all Council member species. It was the most carefully constructed language I had heard from him in 3 days, built specifically to give every delegate in that chamber a way to say yes to something that would be very difficult to reverse. Veth ships in human-settled space with a Council mandate, not as a threat, as a service. Around the chamber I watched delegates process the proposal. Expressions I could read, some I could not, but the general quality of the room was one I recognized. The relief of a path that appeared to resolve the tension, without requiring anyone present to take an uncomfortable position. Censure the disruptive new species for breaking protocol. Authorize Veth access under the cover of humanitarian concern. The pressure in this room would ease, and the situation would continue in a form that was easier for everyone watching, from a distance to live with. I had seen versions of this before. Not in interstellar politics. In smaller rooms with smaller stakes and the same fundamental mechanics. The party with power makes a move that looks generous. The party without power accepts because refusal looks ungrateful, and the cost of refusal seems higher than the cost of acceptance. The people watching let it happen because the discomfort that comes from intervening is immediate, and the discomfort that comes from not intervening arrives gradually, years later, in forms that are harder to connect to this specific moment. Owen prepared to call the vote. I raised my hand. I request 2 minutes before the vote is opened. Owen considered for a moment. Then he recognized me. I stood. I want to give this body information that is directly relevant to the vote it is about to take, I said. On the first day of the Veth blockade of our colony worlds, I issued orders to Earth Defense Corps Command to begin repositioning our fleet assets. I let a single beat of silence pass. Not defensively, the chamber went still. It was a different kind of still from anything I had seen in this room before. Not the polite attention at the opening of a session, not the stunned noise following an unexpected statement, not the absorbed focus of reading. This was the stillness of a room holding its breath while something moved into position that could not be unseen. Our fleet has been in motion for 10 days, I continued, keeping my voice at the same conversational level throughout. The repositioning was completed this morning. I would ask the Veth Dominion to verify the current status of their primary supply corridor between the 2nd and 4th territorial sectors. I would also ask to confirm the operational condition of the monitoring installations they maintain along the outer boundary of their protected space. Scrath stood without being recognized. A fabrication, the translation said, sharp and immediate. A deliberate deception of this council, intended to intimidate these proceedings and manufacture leverage. Check it, I said simply, and sat down. One of his subordinates pressed a communication device to the side of their head section and turned away from the room. The chamber watched. 30 seconds, a full minute, 2 minutes. Nobody spoke. The silence had the particular texture of a room waiting for confirmation of something that might change everything it had just been assuming. The subordinate turned back to Scrath and spoke very quietly. Scrath was motionless for a moment that stretched past the natural length of thought. Then he turned to face the chamber again, and something in the way he held himself had changed in a way that every delegation present seemed to register in the same instant, though none of them would have described it the same way. Ren Allo spoke without being recognized first. His voice was quiet and even. How long have your ships been at those positions? Forward elements have been in place for 6 days, I said. Full deployment completed this morning. You began moving before this special session was called, he said. We began moving 10 hours after the blockade was established, I said. When the blockade went up, our people on those 3 worlds lost outside communication. We could not know the Veth's intentions. We could not know how long the blockade would last, what it was designed to achieve, or what would happen next. I looked at the full chamber when I said the next part, not at Scrath, not at Owen, but at all of them. We do not wait to find out what is coming. We have not done that in a very long time. Nail of the Inari spoke clearly from the rear section. Where exactly are your ships positioned? I transmitted the coordinates to the chamber display. A sector map appeared on the shared screen, showing the Veth supply corridor, the listening installations along their outer boundary, and the current location of every Earth Defense Corps asset in the deployment. The ships were not massed in a single formation. They were spread across a large volume of space in a distributed pattern, positioned at intervals that any military mind in that room would immediately recognize as something specific and deliberate. Not an attack formation, a closing formation. The geometry you use when you need to ensure that nothing moves in any direction without your awareness and without consequence. The chamber studied the map. The Greth were completely motionless. 3 Pelhari delegates had formed a tight, close conversation. Nail of the Inari was studying the map with an intensity that was not observational but evaluative, working through what it meant and where it led. Renalos was looking at the display with both hands flat on the table before him, and an expression I was reading, as best I could read Pelhari expressions, as something close to wonder at something they had not expected to be capable of wonder about. Scrath demanded immediate council condemnation of the deployment. He cited 3 specific regulations, delivered in rapid succession. His voice through the translation had lost the machine quality that had characterized all his prior statements and gained something underneath it. Something not quite anger and not quite uncertainty but sharing qualities of both. Owen listened to each regulation cited. He ruled against each one in turn, quietly and without evident emotion. The vote on sanctions against the Terran Assembly was called. The motion failed, 22 in favor, 31 opposed, 4 abstentions. The announcement was followed by a silence that had weight in it, the weight of something that had been expected to happen not happening, which is always heavier than the weight of the unexpected. Then Nail of the Inari rose and asked to be recognized, and Owen gave them the floor without hesitation. Nail stood straight and spoke clearly, without any of the careful diffidence I had heard in their voice during the earlier sessions. The Inari formally request that this council open an independent review of all Veth Dominion territorial and resource actions conducted under council authorization over the past 100 years. A pause. We make this request because we believe the full record will show a consistent pattern of conduct that this body has failed to adequately examine. Another pause. We have not raised this before. We did not believe it was possible to raise it. We believe the cost of speaking would be higher than the cost of remaining silent. Their voice was steady throughout. We raise it now because someone in this chamber reminded us that a situation is only settled if no one chooses to move. 3 other delegates rose to second the motion before Nail had finished sitting down, all of them from smaller or mid-sized species. All of them speaking in the careful tones of people who had been holding particular words for a long time, and had finally decided the moment had arrived to say them. Scrath objected on procedural grounds. 3 regulations cited. Owen ruled against each one. The motion for review passed by a substantial margin. Scrath held still after the vote was announced. Then he turned and looked at me. It was a look I did not need the translation system to interpret. He understood exactly what had happened in this chamber today. He had arrived expecting a room that would behave the way this room had always behaved. He had expected the established shape of things to hold because it had always held. Instead, the room had shown him a different shape, and the moment for putting what he had seen back in its container had already passed. He left the session without giving the formal closing gesture required by council protocol of all parties, for a delegation that had maintained meticulous procedural compliance for 2 centuries. The omission was noticed by every person still in the room. Owen watched the Veth delegation leave. He said nothing. He simply watched with his independent white eyes until the doors had closed behind them. No one spoke for a long moment after. After the vote, after Scrath had left without his closing gesture, after the chamber had begun to empty, Representative Nael of the Inari came to speak to me directly for the first time. They sat in the chair beside mine and looked at me with their pale eyes for a moment before speaking. I want to tell you something, Nael said. That is not for the formal record. I'm listening, I said. The Veth took something from the Inari 40 years ago, they said. A resource arrangement that we agreed to, because we believed at the time that we had no other option. The terms were presented to us exactly as they were presented to you. Reasonable, temporary, generous in context. They paused. It was not temporary. It has not been reasonable in practice. And the context it was generous in was one that the Veth themselves created specifically to make generosity, on those terms, look preferable to the alternative. I waited. We have had 4 sessions in the past 40 years in which we might have raised this. Nail continued. We prepared to raise it twice. Both times we decided the cost was too high. Both times we believed that speaking would cost us more than silence. They looked at the empty chamber around us, at the rows of seats that a few minutes ago had been full of the 47 species of the Galactic Council, and were now just seats. I want you to understand what it meant when you stood up in this room and said what you said. Not the military position, not the fleet. What it meant was that there was a species in this room that did not believe the cost calculation that everyone else in this room had accepted as fixed. They stood up. That changes the calculation, they said, for everyone. Then they left. And I sat alone in the chamber for a while with the lights dimming around me, and I thought about what they had said. The cost calculation. The assessment of what it costs to speak versus what it costs to stay silent, and the assumption embedded in that assessment that the costs of speaking are always higher than the costs of silence for the party, with less power. It is an assumption that becomes self-fulfilling over time. If everyone believes it, no one speaks. If no one speaks, nothing changes. If nothing changes, the assumption is confirmed. The pattern locks itself into place not through any deliberate enforcement, but through the accumulated weight of everyone's belief that the pattern is locked, until someone stops believing it, until someone makes the first move and finds out whether the ground holds. The ground had held, not because we were powerful enough to guarantee it would. Not because I had calculated a certain outcome. I had calculated a possible outcome and committed to pursuing it regardless of the cost, which is a different thing and a considerably more frightening thing. It had worked in this instance. It might not work the same way the next time. The cost calculation did not change permanently because one species had once refused to accept it. It changed incrementally, case by case, refusal by refusal, across the long slow arc of institutional history, but incrementally was still a direction. And direction, given enough time, was enough. Then Renalos, still in his seat with his hands flat on the table, turned his head toward me and said, very quietly, I had forgotten what it looked like. What? I said. When someone refuses, he said. I had forgotten what that looked like. He gathered his materials and left without another word, and I sat in the nearly empty chamber for a while longer, in my plain chair, watching the lights dim one section at a time. The review proceedings that followed were long and detailed and slow in the way that formal, institutional processes built for accuracy over speed always are. I had anticipated this. I attended every session. I sat in the plain chair I had been given, and took notes, and spoke when speaking was useful, and stayed quiet when quiet was more effective. And I learned the rhythms of this institution, the way you learn the rhythms of any unfamiliar and complex environment, by watching longer than feels comfortable, and moving more carefully than feels efficient, and resisting every impulse to shortcut. The first supplementary material was filed by the Inari 6 days after the review motion passed. It was a detailed account of the resource arrangement the Veth had imposed on them 40 years ago, prepared with the kind of care that told me they had been working on it for some time. That it was not assembled in 6 days but had been waiting, finished and waiting, for a moment when it could safely be submitted. The account ran to 80 pages and cited every relevant council session in which the Inari had raised adjacent concerns that had been noted and not acted upon. I read all 80 pages. Then I sent a private message to Representative Nail, thanking them for the courage it had taken to file it. Nail replied that it had taken less courage than they expected. They said that watching someone else make the first move had, as they put it, changed the temperature of the room. I thought about that phrase for a long time. Changed the temperature of the room. It was the most precise description I had heard of what happens when a system that has been locked by accumulated belief starts to unlock. The temperature changes. The perceived cost of action shifts. Not because the situation has fundamentally altered, but because the fixed nature of the situation has been successfully questioned. And once questioned, the fixedness no longer holds the same weight. The second supplementary filing came from a species called the Thori, who had been involved in a Veth territorial dispute 23 years ago that had been resolved through the settlement mechanism, and who had been declining in territory and council representation in the years since. Their filing ran to 60 pages, and was accompanied by a formal request for the committee to examine whether the terms of that settlement had been executed in good faith by the Veth. The third came 11 days after the second, from a species I had never interacted with directly. Their filing was the shortest of the 314 pages, but it contained something the others had not. Personal testimonies from individual colony administrators and citizens describing in specific detail what the years after their species settlement with the Veth had actually looked like from the inside. Not statistics, voices. Other species began filing supplementary materials. The Inari first, within a week of the initial motion passing, then 2 others, then several more across the following month. Each submission added to the record. Each new voice that joined the proceedings made the option of simply closing the review and returning to the previous arrangement less available to those who would have preferred it. The VETH had excellent legal resources and used every legitimate mechanism available to slow the process and narrow its scope. Every filing received a counter-filing. Every witness statement was challenged on technical grounds. Every procedural ruling was appealed. Watching them work, I could see clearly how they had maintained their position in this institution for 200 years. They knew the system at a depth that came only from long inhabitation of it, from knowing its internal logic and its procedural habits and which levers could be pulled when. They were thorough and capable and entirely committed to the outcome they wanted. But the process was running. It had been opened by a motion that had passed according to correct procedure, and it had to be allowed to run. The materials entering the record were real, and the pattern they revealed was consistent, and each new submission made the available conclusion of ignorance narrower. There are things that once seen cannot be unseen, and one of them is a pattern that runs across 60 years of documented decisions when all those documents are placed in the same room at the same time. The blockade of the colony worlds was formally suspended on the 5th day after the failed censure vote. Suspended pending review, not lifted. The language was precise and carried its customary qualifications. But the ships came home, the supply lines opened. The 400,000 people on those 3 worlds could receive what they needed and communicate with the rest of humanity and wait out the proceedings knowing that the walls were not closing. I received a message from Diane Marsh, the colony administrator on New Meridian, 8 years in her post on a world that had been founded 11 years before she was born. She told me her daughter had been born the day the blockade went up. She said she had watched the council session feed in her office with her staff and did not fully understand everything that had happened, but she wanted me to know that she was less afraid now than she had been the week before. I read that message several times. It was not a diplomatic communication. It was not a policy achievement that could be cited in a proceeding. It was one person telling me that her child was going to grow up in a place that had not been taken from her. I filed it with the things I kept. Ren Alos and I met privately a number of times during the review period, in a small consultation room near the main archive, late in the evening, with cold drinks neither of us was actually consuming. He told me things that were not in any archive I had access to. Context that explained patterns I had noticed in the session records but could not fully account for from the written material alone. He told me that the VETH had not always operated the way they operated now, that in the early decades of their council membership they had been genuinely cooperative partners, had contributed to landmark agreements, and invested in the relationship building that makes large institutions function. Something had shifted over decades, gradually, and in ways that were nearly invisible in any individual session, but very clear when viewed across the full arc. The council had not responded to the shift because responding would have required a kind of confrontation the body had not developed the capacity for. Each individual accommodation had seemed reasonable. The accumulation of those accommodations over time had produced something that nobody had meant to create. I asked him why he had told me to bend. Back at the start, after that first session, he was quiet for a moment. Because I had watched every new species face this kind of moment in the past 30 years and make the same choice, he said. I had seen it happen enough times that I had stopped believing any other choice was available. Not because anyone forced them, because the room had been shaped over such a long time in such a way that the other choice had become invisible. He paused. You saw something else. I read the Duran file, I said. He went completely still. He was quiet for a long time. I haven't heard that name said aloud in years, he said finally. Nobody says it, I said. That's part of the problem. He looked at the table. Do you know anything about what they were like? Almost nothing, I said. The archive has almost nothing. There should be more, he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. I was young when it happened, not yet on the council, but I had colleagues who had worked with them. They were remarkable people, remarkable in specific ways that I still think about. They made extraordinary things. A long pause. The archive should have considerably more than 2 words about them. There was nothing I could say to that which would be useful. Some facts exist at a depth where the right response is simply to be present with them, to resist the urge to make them manageable through language. We sat in the consultation room for a little while, with the cold drinks neither of us was touching. and we let the fact of the Duran be what it was. Then we went back to work. The review ran for 4 months. It produced a formal finding that the pattern of VETH conduct over 60 years had been inconsistent with stated council principles. It recommended a set of procedural changes requiring greater transparency and oversight for future territorial negotiations, involving significant disparities in member capacity. These were real outcomes. They were also partial outcomes, the kind that large institutional processes produce when the subject matter is sufficiently complicated and the affected parties sufficiently powerful. The VETH submitted a counterbrief within the week and pursued every avenue available to them to limit the findings' practical effect. Several of their efforts worked. Several of their usual mechanisms did not work in the ways they had previously worked, because the landscape had shifted, not dramatically, not in ways that could be pointed to in a single instance, but in ways that added up across enough instances to constitute something real. I made mistakes during those 4 months. I misjudged 2 situations and had to recover from them, and both recoveries required the help of people I was still learning to understand. I learned from those mistakes and made different ones afterward. That is what working in a place like this actually looks like from the inside. It is not a series of dramatic confrontations. It is a long, often tedious, frequently uncertain effort to understand a complicated environment well enough to do useful things in it. The dramatic confrontations, when they come, are possible only because of all the ordinary work that came before them. On the night the review committee issued its final formal finding, I went to the viewport at the end of the long corridor outside the main chamber. Late, when the corridor was empty and the chamber behind me was dark and quiet. From that position you could see a long arc of stars against the black, thousands visible to the naked eye, billions more behind those, at distances that extended past anything I could hold in my imagination with any real comprehension. Somewhere in that direction, far past what the eye could separate from the general background light of the galaxy, was the sun. A small yellow-white star, unremarkable by any astronomical measure, orbited by a world where a species had spent 5,000 years learning, mostly through significant difficulty and cost, the lessons that had eventually produced the person standing at this viewport. I thought about the Duran. I had been thinking about them periodically since the night I first read their file. I had asked archive staff to retrieve everything available on them, and the answer had been almost nothing. A few session transcripts, some commercial filings, a species registry entry marked inactive, last updated 41 years ago. No images, no records from their own perspective, no documentation of their culture, their knowledge, the things they made, the questions they were working on when the questions stopped. Just the fading administrative impression of a civilization that had been present, and then was not, in a world that had continued around its absence as though the space had always been empty. I could not do anything about the Duran. I could not give back what had been taken. I could not recover what had been lost. The review had surfaced their case, and the committee had included it in the formal findings as a matter warranting further examination. But further examination of a civilization that no longer existed was a different kind of problem than the ones I had been working on. No living constituency. No remaining voice to speak for anything. Whatever the Duran had been, whatever they had built and known and wondered about, was gone in a way that careful procedural language could acknowledge and could not repair. Ren Alost had said they made beautiful things. During the second month of the review proceedings, I submitted a formal request to the Council Archive Administration, asking that the Duran case file be flagged for historical preservation review, and that any surviving materials related to their civilization be identified and catalogued, regardless of how fragmentary. It was a small request. It changed nothing material about the current situation, but I wanted it in the record. I wanted someone, at some future point, to read the proceedings of this review period and see that someone had asked. The archive administrator responded within a week. She was a Vaeli, one of the long-lived silver-skinned species who maintained this building, and her message was formal and precise, and at its very end contained one sentence that was not formal at all. She said she had worked in the archive for 40 years and nobody had ever submitted a request like mine before, and she was glad someone finally had. I read that sentence several times. 40 years in the archive. 40 years of access to every session record, every proceeding, every case file in this institution. 40 years of walking past the Duran file, past the notation at its bottom, past the administrative absence where a civilization used to be recorded. Not from indifference. From the same calculation that had kept the Inari silent for decades. From the assumption that raising a question about something already finished and settled, and 62 years past was not worth the cost of raising it. We had changed the temperature of the room, not just for the Inari and the other small species who had found the courage to file their supplementary materials. For an archivist who had wanted for 40 years to flag a file for preservation and had not believed until now that the flagging would mean anything to anyone. That was how it actually spread. Not through the dramatic confrontations that got remembered later. Through the accumulation of small moments when individual people decided that the cost of acting was lower than they had previously believed it to be, and acted accordingly, each of those small moments making the next one slightly less costly for the next person. The temperature of the room changing by degrees, until eventually the room itself was different from what it had been. I thought about the archivist's message during the times when the review proceedings were slow and technical, and appeared to be producing nothing. I thought about it when the VETH legal team scored procedural points that limited the committee's scope in ways that frustrated me. I thought about it when I was tired and the work felt distant from anything that would matter. It helped. It reminded me that what I was working on was larger than what I could see from inside any particular session. I believed him, and I kept thinking about them because I believed it mattered to keep thinking about them. To resist, in whatever small way was available, the process by which an absence becomes so familiar that it stops reading as an absence, and becomes simply the natural state of the landscape, something that was never there. I had placed humanity's case before the Galactic Council, and the Council's faces had gone pale, in whatever way their various biologies allowed for paleness. And the thing that had made them go pale was not a weapon or a threat or any particular dramatic action. It was a document. 5,000 years of what happens when you push us. 5,000 years of the answer to the question of what we do when we are pushed. We push back. We have always pushed back. It is one of the worst things about us and one of the best things about us simultaneously. And I had long since stopped trying to resolve that contradiction, and decided instead simply to work with it. My communicator signaled, "Admiral Pierce, fleet confirms all assets returned to standard patrol positions." The message read, "Kearney's confirm full operational status restored. Command standing by. Well done, Commander." I wrote back 3 words, "Not done yet," because it was not done. It was never done in the meaning of finished and settled and requiring no further attention. The VETH remained powerful and present and had demonstrated clearly that they had not revised their fundamental understanding of how the galaxy should be organized. What had changed was not their position. What had changed was the room. The room was different from the room I had entered 8 months ago with my plane chair and my back support, and the complete uninterest of everyone present. More voices in it now. More willingness to say things that had previously been said only in private, if they were said at all. A different understanding, shared if not always spoken aloud, of what the long accommodation led to when it was allowed to run its full course. Without examination, I could not take full credit for that. The Inari had been waiting for someone to move first for a long time. The other species who had spoken had their own histories, their own stored sense of what had been gradually taken from them, their own knowledge of the word at the bottom of files like the Dzukras, and the fear of one day finding it at the bottom of a file with their own name on it. What I had done, perhaps, was demonstrate that the first move did not automatically end the way everyone had come to believe it would end, that a refusal did not produce the outcome it had always been assumed to produce, that the pattern was not as fixed as it had appeared from inside it. That was what Ren Alice had meant. Not the refusal, but what the refusal revealed. The space that exists in any apparently fixed situation for something different to happen. Space that is invisible from inside the assumption that the situation is fixed. Space that only becomes visible when someone decides to step into it and find out whether the ground there holds. The ground had held. I put my communicator away. I stayed at the viewport a little longer, looking at the stars. In the morning there would be a preliminary hearing on the committee's framework for monitoring future VETH territorial activity, and I had 3 points to make in it, and I wanted to be rested enough to make them precisely. The VETH's legal team would push back on each one with technical competence and determination. It was going to be a long session. They were all going to be long sessions. I was fine with that. At some point during that last session, before Scrath had left without the required procedural gesture, I had delivered humanity's formal position statement for the official record. I had done it without drama, in the same level voice I used when giving operational orders. The archivist had logged it. It was in the transcript now. It would be read and debated and cited and argued about for years. I had said, "We do not negotiate with those who place our people's lives under threat without cause." We do not negotiate with those who use the language of peace as a mechanism to extract compliance from those who are not yet powerful enough to refuse. We do not negotiate with those who make other species smaller by degrees, one reasonable concession at a time, until the space those species occupied closes behind them and the only remaining record is 2 words in a file nobody opens. We have a name for that kind of conduct. It is not diplomacy. It is not the management of interstellar order. We do not negotiate with those people. We never have. I went inside. The morning session started early and the work was waiting, and I had learned over 16 years of service that the most important thing, the thing that underlies every other thing, is simply to keep showing up, to be present in the room, to find the floor when things are uncertain and stand on it and do the next thing that needs to be done. That was what we were. That was what we had always been. The galaxy had expected something predictable from us, something small, shaped by the understanding that we were new here, and outnumbered, and out-resourced, and should therefore understand our position. We had given them 5,000 years of evidence of how well that expectation tends to work out. We were still here. The preliminary hearing on the monitoring framework ran for 4 hours. The Veth's legal team was thorough and pushed back on all 3 of my points, with technical precision. We made progress on 2 of the 3, and tabled the 3rd for a subsequent session. I considered this a reasonable outcome for a first substantive hearing, and said so in my notes. In the weeks that followed the review committee's final finding, I received 3 private messages from delegates I had not previously spoken to. All 3 were from smaller species. All 3 messages said variations of the same thing: that they had been watching, that they were considering what they had watched, that they were interested in conversations about how the procedural changes recommended by the review might be practically implemented. None of them were ready to make formal commitments. None of them were ready to be publicly associated with a position that the Veth would notice. That was fine. That was how this moved. Not in announcements but in conversations, not in declarations but in the slow accumulation of relationships built on the shared recognition of something that had previously been too costly to name aloud. I had those conversations. I would continue to have them. I would continue to sit in the sessions and make the filings and do the work that did not look like anything from the outside. And that made everything else possible from the inside. One evening in my 3rd week after the review finding, I walked to the section of the council residential block where the smaller species were housed. The ones who had filed supplementary materials. The ones who had spoken. Not to talk about the proceedings, just to be there. To have a meal in the common area, and participate in the ordinary social rhythms of the building. To be the kind of presence that was familiar rather than only formal. It sounds like a small thing. In an institution built on centuries of relationship, it was not a small thing. Nail of the Inari sat with me for a while over something that passed for tea in their culture, and something that passed for tea in mine. We did not talk about the proceedings. We talked about their world and mine, about what we had each grown up understanding about the galaxy, and what we had each learned since. About the particular strangeness of arriving somewhere as a representative of everyone you came from, carrying the weight of that representation in every room and every conversation. Nail asked me what the word home meant to me, specifically, on Vale Prime, 400 light-years from Earth. I thought about it honestly. It means the 400,000 people on those 3 worlds, I said, and the people behind them, and what comes next. That is a large home to carry, Nail said. Yes, I said, but I didn't pack it. I was born into it, same as everyone. Nail looked at their tea. I wonder sometimes if this is what our people needed, they said. Not a stronger voice. We had voices. Not better arguments. We had those too. Just someone willing to show us that the cost calculation had a different answer than we had been told. I thought about that for a long time after the conversation ended. The cost calculation. The assumption embedded in the power differential. The assumption that had been made true by being universally believed. The assumption that could be interrupted by the simple act of a species deciding not to believe it and accepting whatever consequences followed from that decision. We had a long history of that. The Earth Defense Corps Historical Archive contained 5,000 years of examples of it, and most of those examples ended badly in the short term, and differently in the long term. We had learned to hold both of those facts in mind at the same time, the short-term cost and the long-term direction. We had never been particularly good at it. We had been better at it than giving up. That was what we had put on the table in the chamber. Not a weapon. Not a negotiating position. A record of what we were and what we did when faced with something we were not willing to accept. And the council's faces had gone pale. Not because we were invincible, Not because we were guaranteed to win anything. Because we had demonstrated, in a document, and in a fleet deployment, and in 2 sentences delivered without drama in a formal session, that we were going to make this difficult. That accommodation with us was going to require paying a real price, and that the price would be paid regardless of whether it was strategically convenient because we had a long and documented history of paying it. The stars outside the viewport on those late nights were the same stars they had always been. The distance between Earth and Vale Prime had not changed. The Veth were still here, and still powerful and still capable of significant harm to anyone they chose to direct it at. The Council was still old and complicated and slow and shaped by centuries of accumulated habits that did not change easily. And we were still here. It would be enough. Not forever, and not without cost, and not without the long slow work that had no dramatic moments in it, but enough to keep the direction pointed somewhere other than 2 words at the bottom of a file. I went to sleep. In the morning the work was waiting. It was always waiting. We were still here, and we intended to stay.